Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck overview, this time Gruul Midrange, formerly known as Ponza. If you like these deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below, especially what deck you might like to see us cover next. So Gruul Ponza really has kind of gone away from the old land destruction plan of the deck, and has really embraced the more mid-range Blood Moon version of the deck. And the deck has certainly fallen off in its stature in the format. At one point this was pushing to be a tier 1 deck in the format, but that's been several years. It still has a lot of the new tools, a lot of the good Modern Horizons cards that you'll see in most playable modern decks. Starting off obviously with Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, being one of many cards that enables a turn 2 Blood Moon, one of the most devastating plays in the modern format for a lot of decks. Other things that enable this are Arbor Elf and Utopia Sprawl, both of which play very nicely together, especially on basic forests, enabling you to go possibly a 4 mana play on turn 2, which is why you'll see Karn the Great Creator in this build. Beyond that, you're just playing a Gruul Midrange deck. You're using things like Lightning Bolt to hold your opponent in check, you're using Wrenn and 6 to rebuy fetch lands or Besages and such, really kind of giving you a pseudo land destruction plan, but not really. Beyond that, you're also playing a Fable of the Mirror Breaker, because most good mid-range decks use this. Even Creativity is starting to play this a little bit. This obviously gives you the Goblin Shaman token, it gives you the Reflection of Kikijiki, but you do have a few cards to copy. Seasoned Pyromancer also plays with Fable nicely in terms of, allowing you to chuck cards, rebuy cards, allowing you to figure out the wrong half problem in your deck, dig for your Blood Moons, etc. And then finally, Fury at the top end, kind of your way to either keep your opponent's early aggression in check, or just having this card that comes down on turn 3 or 4 with your acceleration, hits an opponent Planeswalker, and then leaves behind a 3/3 double striker they have to deal with. Overall, not a terrible strategy. This particular version is also choosing to run a Karn package that we'll talk about here in a minute. Rest of the land base, obviously, you're playing a bunch of basic forests, just to enable your Blood Moon strategy. You're also playing some amount of Stomping Grounds, fetch lands, nothing terribly exciting. Besages can help kind of keep decks like Tron, slow them down a little bit, potentially blow up a Bounce Land and Amulet Titan, etc. Nothing terribly exciting, but can be reasonable in some spots. The Karn Wishboard, obviously, Chalice of the Voids, they're good against mainly the various Cascade decks. You have a bunch of 1-drops in your decks, so you generally don't want to be doing that, but you can potentially put Chalice on 1 if it's important against something like Hammer Time. Engineered Explosives, once again, a lot of decks it's good against anything producing a bunch of tokens like Rhinos, Urza Saga, good against a bunch of 1-drops such as out of Burn or Hammer Time. Sundering Titan, what other way to attack these Leyline Binding mana bases? Destroy 3 or 4 lands. If it leaves the battlefield, destroy another 3 or 4 lands. Sky Sovereign, this is proven to be a game breaker, mostly in the Pioneer format, against a lot of the mid-range decks. Serves a very similar role in modern format. Allows you to pressure Planeswalkers, deal with your opponent's smaller creatures, etc. Snaring Bridge, slows your opponent from attacking you, enough said. Unlicensed Hearse, mainly for any type of graveyard nonsense, helps keep things like Murktide Graveyard in checks, or helps against things like Living End and Dredge. Not usually enough on its own, but is a nice tool to have access to. The Stone Brain, Cranial Extraction on a stone. What more can you say? Take your opponent's Primeval Titans, their Living Ends, their Rhinos. Their deck becomes a lot worse. Liquid Metal Coating, probably the go-to default thing to get with Karn since the banning of the 6 mana. Anyways, the go-to thing, land destruction primarily, target your opponent's land with Liquid Metal Coating, target it with Karn, poof, there goes the land. Relic of Progenitus, Tormod's Crypt also helps with the graveyard shenanigans. Zoran Orb, a way to gain a little bit of life in a pinch against something like Burn or something. And then Haywire Might is a new addition to the thing. Gains you a little bit of life, allows you to sacrifice it to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. Interesting way to deal with opposing Blood Moons, Ley Lines, any other number of things that you might run into. Not that those affect you particularly much, but just examples of things that might need blown up, Colossus Hammers, etc. Overall, and then a couple copies of Endurance, once again, kind of help with the graveyard shenanigans, help slow down things like DRC, Ragavan, helps to slow down, living end, etc. So, noticing a lot of anti-graveyard stuff here, probably not a bad thing, as this deck tends to be fairly decent in mid-range mirrors, especially because of the access to Blood Moon. Card I could not think of, Mycosynth Lattice. Card was banned because it's annoying out of Green Karn. Okay, this version is more akin to the traditional Ponza builds. Ponza just being a name that people gave red-green land destruction, which red-green land destruction has largely become into red-green mid-range with Blood Moon and a little bit of land destruction. Not really a whole lot different going on here, other than you don't have the Karn package, so you have a little bit more of a mid-range package. This version is choosing to run Pillage. Destroy target artifact or land, can't be regenerated. Obviously, there are some notable artifacts, but this is mainly out there to blow up your opponent's key lands, slow them down for a turn, potentially get ahead on mana, and then kind of whittle them down with your mid-range threats as quickly as possible. Bone Crusher Giant, this card sees a lot more play, obviously, in the Pioneer format, but can be a 2-for-1, obviously killing one of your opponent's early creatures, or just dealing them 2 damage to their face, and then you're able to cast a 4/3 body. It's a little bit tough to deal with sometimes. Blood Moon, key to the whole strategy. I'm honestly surprised there aren't Megases in some of these sideboards, but maybe Blood Moon's not at its current peak. Endurance, we've already kind of talked about its role in the sideboard. It serves a very similar role in the main deck. It's also a decent flash that on turn 2 can stifle your opponent's development, especially if they're like a deck like Murktide or Living End. Also hits Dredge, some other strategies like Reanimator. Potentially comes in against some of the alternative backup plans for creativity. Sometimes involves them reanimating things. So not the best position it's ever been, but still a fairly solid thing. And it's a 3/4 beater in the worst case scenario. Fury, we've already kind of talked about. Elder Gargaroth. Now, the whole Dies to Doomblade thing. That said, there aren't as many ways to kill Gargaroth. Obviously, you have ways like Unholy Heat turned on, Solitude, etc. But, this card doesn't die to a single Lightning Bolt. It doesn't die to Fatal Push. So it dodges some of the key removal in the format, while also threatening to take over the game against opposing creatures. 6/6 often outsizes most things your opponent can do, other than maybe the largest of Murktide regions. It generally outsizes things like Tarmogoyf. It's comparable to things like the Shadow and such. And it just has all these modes. You can draw cards whenever it attacks or blocks. You can gain some life, which can be relevant against decks like Burn. Add a 3/3 body, so even if they manage to kill it, you still have some amount of board presence behind. Overall, an interesting card. A little bit underpowered for a modern format, but in a deck with the ability to pump out crazy amounts of mana with its busted starts. This is a card you could drop on turn 3, and I'm sorry, this is more powerful than almost any 3-drop in Magic. Sideboard, Run Afoul, target opponent sacrifices a creature with flying. I think this one has Murktide attached to it. Veil of Summer, way to force through your spells against opposing decks. Can also come in against discard spells, but primarily here for counter spells, if we're being honest. Grafdigger's Cage, another way to fight graveyard-based decks. I don't really think Grafdigger's Cage is the best anti-graveyard spell, as it doesn't really hit Living End. And I do believe it also doesn't stop creativity, if I remember the templating on creativity correct. So I'm not sure I really like Relic of Progenitor or Grafdigger's Cage. Maybe there's other reasons to play it that I can't think of. Maybe something like Yawgmoth. But I would probably look to other graveyard hate if I were playing it. Speaking of other graveyard hate, Relic of Progenitus. Once again, you're seeing relics, you're seeing endurances. This deck really doesn't like losing to Murktide. Haywire Might, kind of a artifact enchantment removal in a can, while also being a little bit of life gain against decks like Burn and other aggressive decks. Klothys, this is an interesting card. It's slow graveyard hate, but it's also a really difficult to remove mid-range threat. A couple of years ago, even in the Burn deck, I was like toying with a Klothys Burn deck. Obviously, it's nowhere near as good as it used to be. The graveyard decks are a little bit faster with how they set up. And there are ways to remove March of Otherworldly Light, Prismatic Ending, etc. There are ways to remove it, even if it never turns into a creature. But, still can be a sticky threat in mid-range mirrors, and something you can drop on turn 2 along with Blood Moons and stuff to really make your opponents completely miserable. This version, notably, 1/3/5, gets to play Obosh. Not the most terrible thing in the world. There really aren't a ton of 2-drops that you'd consider running. Obviously, you could consider running some of the removal spells like Lava Coil or Roast. Alternatively, you could also run things like Scavenging Ooze, but generally Obosh is probably worth the cost. And then Fury, we've already kind of talked about its role in the main deck. This version also highlighting a lot of the cards that you used to see play. One of the huge things the Obosh version gives up. You lose Wrenn and 6. But generally speaking, the Gruul decks are not the best Wrenn and 6 decks. They don't get a ton of value from it in terms of you're not using things like Urza Saga and such. Yes, you might have Boseijus. Yes, your fetch lands help you a little bit. But this is not the best at defending Wrenn and 6 and not the best at utilizing Wrenn and 6. It doesn't have particularly strenuous mana requirements like 4 or 5 color Omnath or creativity, etc. Klothys is in the main deck. The main reasons I wanted to point this one out: Bloodbraid Elf, a 3/2 with Cascade, brings along an additional spell. Sometimes that's something like an Arbor Elf and not all that impressive. Sometimes it brings along a Blood Moon or a Seasoned Pyromancer. You get like 7 mana worth of play for 4 mana. Pretty solid card overall. Can help pressure your opponent, your opposing planeswalkers, etc. It is one of the reasons this deck did well until I believe it was Modern Horizons 2 really put the clamps down on the mid-range decks. But, something you should be aware of. Chandra, Torch of Defiance, pretty reasonable planeswalker. Doesn't see much play in the modern format, but it does do a lot of things. It's a source of card advantage, can help with mana acceleration, it can deal with some of your opponent's creatures. And obviously, its ultimate can win the game. Nice thing to have in a planeswalker, but not the best necessarily planeswalker in the format, but still solid in the red and green colors. Sideboard, a couple more options. We've already covered a lot of these. Cindervise. Cindervise is an interesting one. This is kind of like a pseudo Eidolon the Great Rebel against non-creature spells. When your opponent casts a non-creature spell, Cindervise deals 1 damage to them. It's going to be effective against some of the control decks, but it is mainly here for a split card being a removal spell for problematic enchantments and artifacts, while also being this damage source against some of the control decks or cascade decks, etc. Then I guess the moon, when some blood moons are enough, just add more blood moons. Obviously, this gets around some of the hate that people will bring in against you, whether it be Terra Sunder or Force of Vigor or all these other different things. Magus is a little bit less vulnerable to those, but if you're playing against a red deck, Unholy Heat or Lightning Bolt does answer it, so you got to be aware of what your opponent's answers might be. Obstinate Baloth, very good against the aggressive decks, particularly against decks like Burn. Obviously, Burn can have some anti-life gain stuff, or other aggressive decks can have something along those lines. Like I said, mainly this is for Burn, I would presume. There aren't too many other truly aggressive decks in the format, other than Hammer, but this wouldn't be something you would bring in the Hammer matchup. It just doesn't do enough against a 10/10 attacking creature. But it is a card. It can help when you need a little bit of life gain in a pinch against other aggressive decks. Maybe you've got humans in your meta or something, and this is a card you can bring in those style matchups. Boil, don't like islands. Here's an instant speed, blow up your islands. If your opponent ever taps out, kaboom, there go your islands. Fracturing Gust, this is kind of a go-over-the-top version of Force of Vigor. This blows up everything that's an enchantment or artifact. Now, keeping in mind, you do have some in the form of Utopia Sprawl and Blood Moon, so you got to be a little bit careful, but these are definitely something you bring in against Affinity decks, Hardened Scales, Hammer Time, etc. Definitely go over the top thing. Buffers your life total. Can be a huge blowout in those matchups. Then Engineered Explosives, we've already kind of covered. Anything 1 or 2 mana, this helps cover. Helps deal with tokens out of Rhinos and Urza's Saga, etc. As far as the deck strengths and weaknesses, this deck is very dependent on its mana acceleration. This version, obviously not choosing to run Ragavan. It's a little bit more of an older school version of the deck, obviously with the exception of Fury. The deck can be very clunky in the hands that you don't have the early acceleration, so oftentimes you have to mulligan to an Arbor Elf or Utopia Sprawl or Ragavan. If you don't have those openers, the deck can be very slow by modern standards. That said, in metas where Blood Moon is good, this deck tends to be fairly reasonable. While it doesn't have the grinding tools quite of an Omnath or a Creativity or a lot of these decks, it puts pressure on mana bases of decks because of Blood Moon, while also being a fairly reasonable mid-range deck. It tends to be a slight dog to decks like Burn, because obviously it doesn't do a lot of what Burn hates to deal with. There isn't a ton of life gain in the deck, but it does have tools to deal with things like that, with things like Klothys, Obstinate Baloth, etc. It's probably a little bit soft to a deck like Murktide, as Murktide obviously being a tempo-based deck, and this deck wanting to resolve bomb after bomb after bomb. That said, If you answer your opponent's early Ragavan, get a Blood Moon down, maybe mess with your opponent's mana just a tiny bit, this is a deck that can get ahead and compete with those style of decks. Doesn't have a ton of things for non-linear combo, hence why you're seeing things like all these graveyard hate pieces, so decks like Living End, Reanimator, etc. just really kind of mess with the deck. A deck like Amulet Titan, if you don't have a Blood Moon, just doesn't care about any of the stuff you're doing. So, this deck is really a lot of times Blood Moon or bust game 1, or just having a fast opener. In some ways, it's with scam before scam. It really relies on powerful openers and then getting the game over before your opponent recovers, and has a reasonable mid-range game plan if you need to go pound for pound into the mid-game. That said, it's kind of gotten outpaced by some of the other mid-range decks of the format, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside, but it is another one of those decks, much like, Dredge, Tron, Burn, sometimes even Jund Saga, that will pop up on occasion. Is something you need to be aware of, and if you have a Blood Moon aficionado in your meta, this is up there with like Rakdos Scam and Isn't Murktide as a deck that can function and do well with Blood Moon in it. So, as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what deck you'd like to see us cover next.